I don't have to introduce the panelists because they've been introduced. They're all distinguished scholars of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. So I'm just going to start by throwing out some issues that I think should be addressed at the conference, and then I'll pose a few questions to the panelists. Perhaps after a half hour or so, we can open this for audience members to ask questions or react to anything that they've heard. I'm been very impressed with the audience's engagement and sophistication and commitment to exploring these issues, and have learned a great amount from talking to audience members in between panels out in the hallway. So I would welcome anybody when we get to that point of the session to participate by asking questions. We'll have to keep it somewhat short for each person so we can get all of the people who want to participate in. Let me start by talking briefly about how I personally got engaged with this subject and some of the problems that, clearly can be seen in the experience of my cohort. And I think we can connect some of this to the issues that have been addressed in discussing the World War II period. I was born after the war, several years after the war. My father was a combat veteran in the U.S. Army. His division was in frontline combat against the Wehrmacht for 195 consecutive days. He was wounded twice. His division liberated the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. The name Werner von Braun came up yesterday, and of course he was one of the commandants of that camp, where slave laborers were worked to death in underground caverns manufacturing the V-2 rockets. And when his division got in there, just about everybody was dead. There were piles and piles of corpses there. So I was able to learn a good deal about the Holocaust from talking with him, even as a small child. He would talk about this with me. But I must say that I went all the way through school, both in the American and for a time in the British school systems, without the Holocaust ever having been addressed by the teachers. I did learn an enormous amount in 1961, at a time when I was living in Brussels, from reading the Paris Herald Tribune's accounts of the survivors' testimony in Jerusalem at the Eichmann trial, which was an important educational experience for my cohort. But it's interesting to think about the fact that the US and British school systems, long after the Holocaust, were not teaching about it. We're not exposing the next generation to what had happened. And that I think is very important to think about. There's also the issue of the total failure of the Allied denazification program after World War II. Even the most sadistic, brutal war criminals responsible for slaughtering large numbers of people in the most horrifying manner were given light punishments. Life in prison was commuted to 30 years, was commuted to 10 years, and these people were released in Germany to receive heroes' welcomes in their hometowns. This is one issue I would like the panelists to address. In terms of looking at the Holocaust, we've concentrated at the conference for the most part in the period between 1940 and 45. But it's also important to look at what was going on before 1940 and to look at what was going on after 1945, and also to try to address the serious problem we have today of Holocaust inversion, of people misusing the word genocide, trivializing it, trivializing the Holocaust, calling any kind of persecution a Holocaust, stripping the Holocaust of any meaning. And the mass media in both the United States and Britain is very guilty of doing this. I was in Britain during the Gaza war, and there's an uninterrupted series of tirades implying that Israel was behaving like Nazi Germany. Everything is being inverted here. Israel is the new Nazi Germany. And this type of thing is being promoted on college campuses today. So this is something to consider. Now, because I want the panelists really to provide their analyses, I'm going to start with a question about an incident that did take place before 1940, and I don't think has been mentioned yet at the conference, the issue of the ship, the ocean liner St. Louis, which was carrying Jewish refugees from Germany, hoping to find refuge and believing they would find refuge, having been issued papers to enter Cuba, and being barred when the ship arrived there, and then attempting to enter the United States, and the Roosevelt administration not admitting them either, and they were turned back to Europe, where most of them were going to die. In the recent book by Richard Brightman, he, I think, completely distorts this issue, and I want to ask Dr. Madoff for his comment, since he's an authority on this episode, if he could comment on the whole issue of the St. Louis. There is an exhibit at Yad Vashem about it, but it's astounding to me that it's being distorted in a book that's receiving a lot of attention today.
I would say that the voyage of the St. Louis by now has become probably the single best-known symbol of America's response to the Holocaust, which is to say, when I speak in various venues, what I often find is that a very significant number of people, Jews as well as non-Jews, are familiar with at least the outlines of what happened to the St. Louis. Sometimes they don't even know they don't recall the name of the ship, but they say, oh yeah, that ship that was turned away. Sort of in the same way that Anne Frank has become like the best known symbol in America of the Holocaust in general, the St. Louis, I think, has come to occupy the place of being the best known symbol of America's, or the Roosevelt administration's, indifference to the plight of the Jews in Germany. And I guess that's sort of understandable in the sense that the St. Louis, like the story of Anne Frank, brings in a personal and a human dimension. So it's not just statistics and piles of corpses, but here are people with, real people with real lives. You see photographs of the St. Louis. There are, little children at the windows looking out, hoping that they're going to be given permission to land and so forth. Professor Brightman has indeed ignited sort of a new controversy over the St. Louis in his book, FDR and the Jews, having to do, in the first instance, with the role of the Coast Guard. Now, until his book appeared, there was never a controversy about the Coast Guard, because the basic story of the St. Louis, of course, is that after it was turned away from Cuba, it sailed north to the coast of Florida and hovered off the coast there for 3 days. The passengers sent telegrams to the White House and pleading for permission to land, which of course they were denied. And during those 3 days, though, as the ship sort of sailed back and forth there in the coast of southern Florida, it was followed by a Coast Guard cutter, which was positioned in between the St. Louis and the coast. The remarkable thing about Professor Brightman's book is he writes that it's not true that the Coast Guard was sent by President Roosevelt to keep the ship away from the coast. As a result of that, a group of passengers, people who were actually on the St. Louis, then issued a public statement taking issue with Professor Brightman and saying that, of course, the Coast Guard was there. We were on the ship. We saw the Coast Guard. You can't claim it wasn't there because we saw it with our own eyes. And of course, those of us who have researched the episode know that it was featured very prominently in the press accounts. Remember, the story of the St. Louis really unfolded in front of the eyes of the world. Now, unlike other aspects of the Holocaust itself, where the Germans tried to hide what was happening from the eyes of the world, the case of the St. Louis was on the front pages of all the major American newspapers each day as the drama was unfolding. And if you look at those newspaper accounts, you see, for example, and many of them feature an Associated Press report, which describes very matter-of-factly how a Coast Guard cutter was there guarding the coast, because that's what the Coast Guard does. So the passengers, the former passengers, St. Louis survivors, protested this account. And what I did is I contacted the office of the Coast Guard historian, and there is such a thing. The Coast Guard has its own historian, and I contacted him to learn more about the responsibilities of the Coast Guard in this instance, because the claim of Professor Brightman, in addition to suggesting that the Coast Guard wasn't even there, he also claims in a subsequent passage specifically that President Roosevelt, he said it this way: there's no evidence that any order was ever given from the White House or the administration to the Coast Guard to go out there and keep the ship away. But after corresponding with the Office of the Coast Guard historian, and after he shared with me this enormous book of the rules and regulations of the responsibilities of the Coast Guard, what was clear is that, of course, there was no order from the White House to the Coast Guard, because that's not how it works. The Coast Guard guards the coast. They don't have to receive orders from the president to keep a ship from making an unauthorized landing. That's their major purpose. So as soon as the St. Louis got within a few miles of the Coast Guard, as a matter of its legal duty, went out there to position itself in such a way that the St. Louis would not try to, head for the shore. Nobody knew, of course, what Captain Schroeder of the ship intended to do, whether he might try an unauthorized landing. So that's why the Coast Guard was there. So to say that President Roosevelt did not order it is really a very disingenuous way of trying to absolve FDR of responsibility by saying, well, he didn't order it. Well, nobody ordered it because he didn't have to order it. He knew that's what the Coast Guard would do, and that, of course, is what it did. But the broader question about President Roosevelt's response to the St. Louis incident, I think, is this: what could he have done realistically? Let's get beyond the fact that, on an emotional level, of course, we all wish he had done something to let those Jews in. But in terms of the actual circumstances at that moment, is it reasonable to say he should have let them in? Because that was the 1 year that the German quota was filled. I've alluded to the fact that in 11 of the 12 years that President Roosevelt was president, the German quota was not filled, and in most of those years it was less than 1/4 filled. But the 1 year the quota was filled was 1939, because they allowed the quota to be filled in the wake of the Kristallnacht pogrom. So it was just the bad fortune of the St. Louis that when it arrived in the end of May 1939, beginning of June, the quota was filled. There was no way to allow those German Jewish refugees into the U.S. under the existing quota system. Could the president have issued, for example, an executive order granting them emergency permission to land? In theory, yes. In theory, yes. But given the political climate in 1939, that strikes me as a very unreasonable expectation, given the isolationist mood, given the strong opposition in Congress and among the public to increased immigration. Going out of his way with such a gesture, although it would have been a very fine humanitarian gesture, it's hard to imagine any president in those circumstances issuing an executive order. So does that mean then that there was in fact nothing FDR could have done, and really we should all just stop criticizing him so much and complaining about the St. Louis? The answer is, in fact,
there is something very important he could have done that would not have involved any significant political cost. And I'm not just saying this in retrospect, I want to describe to you what actually happened at the time. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau intervened. Now, in general, Morgenthau did not bring up Jewish issues to the president. He was, as we've noted, a personal friend of FDR's. He was the only Jew in the cabinet, and he had a sense that it wasn't his right to bother the president with Jewish concern. So until the famous incident years later, which led to the creation of the War Refugee Board, this, with the St. Louis, is the only other time we know of where Morgenthau specifically went to the president, specifically raised, not to the president, but specifically raised a Jewish concern. He went to Secretary Hull. And thanks to the documents known as the Morgenthau Diaries, we have a transcript of the telephone conversation, two of them, between Morgenthau and Secretary Hull. And we also, by the way, have a very interesting, we have a transcript of a conversation between Morgenthau and the Coast Guard. And I'm going to mention that first, even though it's out of order. Because in the discussion with Hull, Morgenthau also asks him, by the way, where is the ship located right now? And Hull didn't know, and he said, you can check with the Coast Guard. We have a transcript of Morgenthau calling the Coast Guard, and Morgenthau starts the conversation by saying, I've seen from the press, from reading in the papers, that the Coast Guard has been following the St. Louis. Do you know where it is? And the Coast Guard commander, whose name was Rose, says, yes, we have been following it. And then they get into a discussion about it, which is a primary source evidence that, in fact, they were out there following it. Anyway, so Morgenthau proposed to Hull a very creative solution to the St. Louis crisis. He said, what about allowing these refugees to land temporarily in the Virgin Islands? So the Virgin Islands was an American territory, but not a state. And the distinction is important here because the quota regulations did not apply in the Virgin Islands. They also did not apply in Alaska. He said, why don't you allow them to land temporarily in the Virgin Islands? They could have visitors' visas, which are good for 6 months and then could be renewed. Let them stay there temporarily. Now, remarkably, just 5 months earlier, the governor and the legislative assembly of the Virgin Islands had publicly offered to open their doors to Jewish refugees. This was in the wake of Kristallnacht, and in a gesture of humanitarian sympathy, the governor and the legislative assembly said they would welcome Jewish refugees. So the local leadership said, let them come. So Morgenthau says to Hull, why don't you take them up on that offer and give them visitors' visas? But Hull's response is so typical of the whole mindset in the administration. Instead of taking advantage of a creative solution that would not have violated the immigration laws, I doubt very much there would have been any significant backlash in the U.S. because they wouldn't be coming into America. They're not taking into these jobs. They're not threatening anything about the mainland. Instead, Hull looks for any way to deny them admission. Hull's response is, we have already discussed this, and apparently it's pretty clear there was a discussion involving the president, although we have no transcript of it. But Hull apparently discussed it with the president and others. And he said, the problem is that it technically, he didn't say technically, I'm saying technically. Technically, to receive a visitor's visa, you had to have a permanent address to which you could return when the visa expired. He said, so since these people are coming from Nazi Germany, and we don't know if it will actually be safe for them to return, therefore they don't have valid return addresses, so we can't let them in. Which is really an unbelievable catch-22. Because it's not safe for them to return, we can't let them in, therefore they have to return. And so on that basis, on that technicality, the opportunity to rescue the passengers of the St. Louis was squandered, and the ship was forced to sail back to Europe. Not back to Germany, because during the course of the voyage back to Europe, representatives of the Joint were able to negotiate with the governments of Holland, Belgium, France, and England to each take in a portion of the passengers. The portion that went to England survived the Holocaust, obviously, since England was never invaded by the Germans. But those who went to Belgium and Holland and France, approximately half of them, and in each case it's approximately the same proportion as other Jews in those countries, were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators in the Holocaust.
Okay, I have a question. I think the other two panelists might be interested. I know Laurel addressed. I don't know if you. I asked yesterday about the U.S. Denazification policy and how the American press covered the whole situation with the displaced persons, because one thing I think hasn't gotten much attention at the conference is the fact that the survivors of the Holocaust straggled back to their homes, generally having lost all of their relatives, all of their property, and finding their homes confiscated. And many of them are confined behind barbed wire, often in former concentration camps where they're guarded by people who had served in the Nazi army. Is there anything you want to add about the American press treatment of this issue? And then I also want to ask about the Polish situation after we finish discussing that, because in Poland there's certainly a very savage reaction to Holocaust survivors. There's the pogrom at Kielce, where Jews are slaughtered in 1946. And in fact, is there coverage in the United States about that sort of thing, about post-war pogroms? It's horrible, so horrible what happened in the Holocaust, and to think that on top of that, the survivors are having to suffer this kind of abuse and terror.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about it. I mean, I only looked at the coverage in the immediate post-war period, so I didn't go into 46. And I did that mainly, partially by way of contrast, to see if some of the issues that had arisen during the war in terms of the coverage, what happened when the circumstances changes, when there was no longer war. And I mean, the American press did cover the displaced persons camps. I think they didn't necessarily do it perfectly, but they certainly addressed, I mean, there was a major controversy in 45 about the Americans' treatment of the displaced persons, and that was covered in the American press. I do think, however, that one of the striking things about the coverage, at least it was striking to me, was while there was a lot of discussion about what was happening to the survivors in the camps and how the American administration was handling that, and then also the rising issue of Jews wanting to go to Palestine. What was striking to me was in all of the coverage I saw for 45, and this would have been in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Herald Tribune, which were the papers that I looked at, there was not a single interview with a survivor. I mean, there were 3 people in one of the bigger camps that were sort of spokespeople, and they were interviewed maybe a little bit. But in terms of what we would now describe as a survivor testimony, meaning someone saying, here's who I am, here's where I'm from, here's what happened to me during the course of the war, there's none of that. And I think that is mostly a function of that was not the kind of journalism that was done at the time. Journalism at the time was not really oriented towards telling personal stories. It was much more about what officials were saying. So that explains it, I think, at least to some extent. But I think what it illustrates is it's one of the reasons, and again, looking at the post-war period, why it took so long for the Holocaust to have any kind of grasp on the American imagination. I mean, if in the immediate post-war period you started hearing the kinds of stories that we heard in the 80s, then I think it might have been very hard for Professor Tanke to describe himself as learning that the Holocaust, that Americans didn't know anything about it. I think part of the root of that experience is in the post-war period, and I think that that's pretty interesting. So that would be all I'd say. Thanks.
Now I want to turn our attention to Poland and ask about the situation there in the immediate post-war era, and also reading Richard Rashke's book on the uprising of the slave laborers in the Sobibor annihilation camp. I think it's noted that for decades and decades. The site of that camp, I mean, it was just overgrown, but and untended, and you could walk down the railroad tracks and see the bones of murdered Jews just lying around like trash. And the government had put up a memorial which made no indication that this was a camp where only Jews were annihilated. It gave the standard communist view that the Jews were one among a large number of groups that had been equally persecuted. So if you could comment on the situation in the immediate post-war period in Poland for Jewish Holocaust survivors, and perhaps also the failure of the Polish government to pay proper attention to this was the country with the largest Jewish community in Europe prior to the Holocaust. You could address that also.
You have raised, in fact, several different issues. One is the post-war retribution to the collaborators, both German Nazis, non-Nazis, and collaborators, citizens of other countries. The other is the way of commemorating or not commemorating the Holocaust of the Jews, as opposed to the terror against other victims of the Nazi rule, German rule in Eastern Europe. And third is the matter of the distribution and redistribution of responsibility. And I think a significant part of our discussions here is exactly about the redistribution of responsibility. And I would like at the end, if I have time, to return to this topic, because there are some interesting aspects, the tendencies that I can see in this room that we may welcome, but there is also a risk inherent in it. So let me start with the question of retribution, or bringing the collaborators to justice. And here, as everywhere in former German occupied Europe, be it France or Belgium, you have first a wave of lynching, actually private retribution against your neighbors who harassed you using German administration to make profit of it. And here the numbers are very unclear, but what is clear that Poland was extremely dangerous place in 1944, 45, 46, first due to an unlimited number of weapons available to anyone who would like to go to a forest and pick up one. Second, because of a dramatic demoralization of the war period. That means the value of human life dramatically decreased. And people got used to the sight of death. And killing someone was not perceived as horrible as it has been before 1939. So you have effects of watching the German barbarity, and this applies also to the Jews. Speaking about the government, not the population, but the government, that was the de facto communist government. Well, the communists were very eager to punish any collaborator with fascist Germany, and this is very clear. As communists, as Poles, and in people who were Poles and wanted to appear as Polish patriots, that was a pillar of the legitimacy, that the Soviet army liberated Poland and now we are going to bring to the justice all German criminals and also their collaborators. And in fact, they have established a special legal framework for this, quasi-revolutionary legal framework for prompt and fast dealing with the collaborators, so-called August Decree against collaborators with the Hitlerite German occupation, which brought several thousand people. I wouldn't say to justice, because it wasn't often the justice. For example, a significant proportion of anti-communists who were imprisoned or executed, and who during the war were in the anti-German underground, who actually fought against the German occupation, were then persecuted on the basis of the same decree. But said, for example, a significant number of people who betrayed the Jews to the German administration was brought to justice, and in fact, a significant proportion of the source materials that we have on the blackmailers, extortionists, and informers to Gestapo, we had from the archives of this legal institutions that were dealing with the collaboration. The question is, was it adequate? And we have, my colleagues have investigated several cases of exactly the people who are accused of denouncing Jews to the German authorities, and it depends. It mostly depends on the circumstances. We know that the perpetrators or alleged perpetrators were quite often able to mobilize their neighbors to testify that they were innocent. And because, as a rule, there were few Jewish witnesses to say something different, at least some of them escaped justice, but many of them actually spent a few years in prisons. And the irony of history is that many of them were released in 1956 along the de-Stalinization. There was a general amnesty, and many of them were released at that time together with the anti-communists who were imprisoned. And you have some quite ironic scenes of a single cell in a prison when you have anti-Nazi partisans and former Nazi collaborators sitting together. And my favorite scene is a scene where actually the future citizen of this country, a Jewish communist, was imprisoned in the early 1950s as a deviant communist, and she was in a single cell with an ethnic German informer of the German authorities occupied Poland, and a female member of the Polish Home Army, an anti-communist and anti-Nazi, anti-German fighter, and they had somehow to live in a single cell. So this is the irony of history that most of them left the prisons after 56. So this is about the justice. The communists set up a special national tribunal, which dealt with the most prominent cases of German criminals, hanging them, and kind of iconic scenes of senior Nazi officials being hanged, actually public executions. In the early post-war years, you have cases of public executions. I think the biggest one was in Poznań, a quite horrendous scene. Later on, the communists decided not to make a show out of it, but initially, these were very popular. Thousands of people were coming to see the hanging of the German senior officers or Nazi party officials in occupied Poland. Now, the question of the fate of the Jewish survivors in post-war Poland, which was related. First, we don't know how many Polish Jews survived the war. We can estimate how many of them perished because most of them perished. But the problem is that who is the Jew by the Nazi definition does not fit with the pre-war administrative definition of who is the Jew, and that was decided since by religion, Judaism, or mother tongue Yiddish. Or some people declared Hebrew as Zionists. That was a political declaration. The problem was that for the Nazis also, Christians of Jewish origin were Jewish, because their grandparents were Jewish. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, you have a Roman Catholic parish, kind of ghetto inside the ghetto. And of course, these people who had been assimilated or their parents already had converted had much greater chances for survival outside of the ghetto because they spoke fluent Polish, they had Christian rituals, prayers, and so on. So we may assume they were overrepresented among the Polish survivors of the Holocaust, Polish Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And this is an irony because they were Jewish only for the Nazis in this sense, right? And some of them, what the Nazis did in all of Eastern Europe, they made the Nuremberg definition the practical definition, namely, anyone who was facing death as a Jew was behaving as a Jew, that means hiding. So what we find, a completely illiberal definition, which may be against someone's self-declaration of who one is, okay, was made practical. And of course, these people were also perceived as Jews because they behaved as Jews. They were trying to hide for very good reasons. So we don't know how many of people of this kind survived the war because they didn't turn to the Jewish organization for assistance. We know that some 250,000 people were registered with Jewish committees at different moments. So we believe that in total some 300,000 Polish Jews survived the war. We don't know with any certainty how many of them were. Some of them survived in the concentration camps in Western Germany or survived the death marches somewhere and were liberated in different parts of Germany by the Allied forces. And most of those people did not return to Poland. Some of them did, most didn't. They remained in the displaced person camps, and most of them then migrated or to British Palestine or to Israel after 1948. So we have some 250,000 Jews in Poland, and I must state that the word Poland is very unclear in 1945, 44, 46, because this is a country which proportionally lost almost the same amount of territory as Nazi Germany. And Poland was a victor of the Second World War, but it lost 20% of the territory, which was its eastern half. So what is Poland after the war? A third of the territory of Poland after the war is the German territory, legally, the territory annexed from Germany. And you have this incredible mass migrations in all the chaos of the post-war period, and here you have the Jewish survivors coming. And what we know is that most of them immediately want to emigrate. And some of them try to establish a life, and then they decide to move. And the key moment is the Kielce pogrom, which you mentioned. So out of some 120,000 Polish Jews who were present in Poland and emigrated before the communists closed down the borders in 1947-48, which coincided with the establishment of Israel, by the way, about a half, some 120,000 left. And out of it, 70, maybe a little more, thousand left after the Kielce pogrom in just a few months. That was a wave of refugees escaping from Poland. What the reasons they had for emigration? Of course, insecurity. Poland was a very dangerous country for everyone because of the widespread banditry, and criminal gangs killed probably more people than were the victims of the civil war between the communists, backed by the Soviet Union, and anti-communists, which took at least 20,000 lives in the first few years after the war. But Jews were also targeted exactly as the Jews. That means they were targets as people who may possess something and be robbed. They were targets as real or alleged participants in the civil war, and if they were real participants, they were, as a definition, on the communist side. Yes, it's true. Many Polish Jews, and especially not only Jewish communists, strongly supported the new communist regime for two reasons. First, that the Soviet army liberated the remnants of the Jews in Eastern Europe, as it was said here. And second, that the communists did promise at that time full practical equality, and we can accuse them on anything but not anti-Semitism, certainly. And they were giving protection to the remnants of Polish Jews, while the anti-communists very often were openly anti-Semitic, and that's clear. So the Jews were killed as communists, they were killed as people allegedly possessing something, the infamous Jewish gold, but also strictly as Jews. So if you throw a grenade to a Jewish orphanage, you don't do it because these kids are communist, okay? You want to kill Jewish children. So the combination of these three reasons made Poland extremely insecure, and estimates vary between 500 and 1,500 Jews being killed in Poland, 44 to 47, which means that the probability of being killed while someone was Jewish was much higher than the probability of being killed when someone was not Jewish. Okay, it was a very dangerous country, but it was especially dangerous for the Jews. Second reason to leave Poland was that it was a big cemetery. And we hear it again and again, we read it in diaries, people coming to this small town, and they are the last surviving Jew and one of the few Jews, and simply they don't want to live in places that were the scenes of horrors. And also you have this, symbolic religious dimension of living in the cemetery, remaining in the cemetery. That was probably the most widespread motif. At least the Committee of Polish Jews, in a document sent to the American Jewish Organization, while listing reasons for mass immigration, it gave this one as the first reason. So the first, people who no longer want to live in Poland or Eastern Europe in general, then insecurity, and then other reasons. What were the other reasons? And this wasn't stated in the document. Well, some Jews didn't want to live under a communist rule, especially those who had the chance to be deported by the Soviets into Siberia in 1940. They knew quite well what does it mean, the Soviet rule. And third, especially those Jews who were religious. They knew what is the position of religion in the Soviet Union, what does it mean to a religious person of any denomination under the communist rule, so they wanted to emigrate. So you have a complex set of motifs which made half of the Polish Jews immigrate immediately after the war, with significant support of Brycha, the secret network of Zionist organization, to bring them out. Now, speaking about the distribution and redistribution of justice, when I was listening, and let me make a general comment here. Relative responsibility of Churchill, Roosevelt, and others, and Professor Groth properly referred to the Kantian principle that the responsibility is proportional to the capacity of act. But I would add to the capacity of act in this specific matter. So, for example, Polish government in exile was relatively powerless, not relatively, was powerless comparing to the United States and the Soviet Union. But it had the power of influencing Polish population to help the Jews. So in this specific matter, it wasn't powerless. It could do something, and it could have done more than it did. So if they apply the specificity criterion, then I would say we didn't speak enough about the Soviet Union, okay? Because the distance for the Soviet airplanes to Auschwitz, Chełmno, Treblinka, and any other place of Jewish persecution in Eastern Europe was much closer than southern England or southern Italy. And expecting Joseph Stalin to be particularly sympathetic to the Jews, and I would like to remind you that before 1939, it was Stalin who killed more Jews than Hitler during the Great Purges and the Great Famine would be probably a misallocation of expectation this person. But if we apply any normative principles, if we don't speak descriptively but prescriptively about it, we should judge Stalin and the Soviet Union by the same rules we apply to Roosevelt and Churchill. And in this case, we may ask a question, did the Soviet army, the Soviet leaders, did anything they could do? And I think it's a good question, but insufficiently specific. Did they do all they imagined they could do, or they knew they could do? This is the right question. Because there were acts that we can raise today, but no one imagined during the war. For example, to my knowledge, no one during the war raised the issue of bombing the Drancy camp near Paris from where the French Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Okay? So that was a non-topic. We cannot blame anyone for refusing to bomb Drancy because no one imagined such an option. It would be anachronistic to raise it in reference to 1943 or 44. So speaking in these terms, we can more precisely redistribute the responsibility, but I would see a limit to this redistribution, which I raised in my speech at this conference, namely listening to Professor Medoff's criticism of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the comment that he was supportive of Harvard introducing numerus clausus for the Jews, I suddenly realized that our anti-Semites, Polish anti-Semites, they were not as abhorrent as I was founding them to this moment, because they were applying something which was normal in the Western world, limiting the proportion of Jews at the university. I always thought that numerus clausus was something horrible, and there I led, they did it at Harvard. So the reasonable limit for me is, while redistributing responsibility, we should not take too much of the responsibility from the direct perpetrators. Okay? The more we put it on Roosevelt, don't take it from the Nazis. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I just want to say a quick thing about Harvard, just because it wasn't normal. In fact, Harvard proposed it, and because there was a big outcry, largely led by Jewish alums, they actually didn't impose it. On the other hand, what they did do is they did do it surreptitiously. So does that make it normal? Not normal. I mean, they had to do it. That's the whole origin of the current admission system, was the idea in the 1920s to keep Jews out. And so then they devised other ways of doing it, like introducing your extracurriculars. So, are you a good athlete? Well, a lot of Jews from the Lower East Side weren't good athletes, so that became a convenient way of keeping them out of Harvard and Yale and Princeton and places like that. So I just don't want us to think that in the fact you had to do it underground means that it was not normal. But the fact it was done is also important.
They also asked an applicant to state his or her religion on the application form. There were alumni interviews, principals' recommendations, all of which were used as a way of screening out Jews. All of these methods were developed and implemented first by Columbia University in the 1910s. Harvard, in 1922, under President Lowell, tried to introduce a formal quota for Jewish admissions, kind of on the European pattern. In the United States, but in Europe, this was done by government action generally. That's not the way it's done in the United States. But this is something that has had a very significant impact on Jewish lives. Wherever it was applied, this constricted Jews' opportunities for upward mobility, for pursuing the lines of study they wanted to, and damaged the lives of several generations of Jews. It was a terrible thing, and the idea that everyone does it doesn't make it right. It was despicable. Okay? Now, Rafi, do you have anything that you want to add? Okay, look, I do want to allow the audience, we have 12 minutes, I'm told now, for audience questions. And I'd ask you to ask a question. Try to keep it brief, because it's a very engaged audience, and there's large numbers of hands that go up. So you can address anything that was said by any of the panelists, or if you heard the presentations of any of the people on the panel and want to ask anything further about that, feel free to do that. It might be best if you would stand when you ask your question and try to keep it brief so we can get as many people in as possible. Is there anybody in the audience who wants to address any of the issues that have come up here? Okay, yes, please. Could you?
Question to Professor Stola. Has there been any, or was there any, recompense to Jews that had to abandon their Polish property in light of
This one I couldn't hear.
similar types of activities?
Okay. This is a very complex issue. Actually, Poland is the only post-communist country in Europe not to have a reprivatization or compensation act, a general one. So individuals can get their property back or compensation back on an individual basis in courts, but not generally. But this is not it's not a specifically Jewish issue. It's a much more general issue. It applies. There is no discrimination on the basis of ethnicity or religion. Although it was very clear after the war that because most of the Holocaust victims, Second World War victims of Poland were Jewish, that was very clear. And the communists designed a quite smart legal instrument for so-called abandoned property, not specifying whose was the abandoned property, but most of the abandoned property was Jewish because there were no direct heirs. If they were heirs, they could immediately take into possession this property and claimed back. If no heirs, direct heirs, show up into a limited period, it went into the state administration and was eventually nationalized. So eventually, Polish state took most of it. However, you must remember that because Poland lost about half of the territory, where some 40% of Polish Jews had lived before the war, it became so to say a problem of the Soviet Union, right? Second, because of destruction, speaking in Warsaw about Jewish property would be largely, I say, fictional, because it was fully destroyed. You know the photographs of Warsaw after 1945, and especially the northwestern Warsaw, where the Jewish population concentrated. It was a sea of ruins. So, if you ask about the present moment, we have thousands of cases of individuals getting their property back or getting a compensation for their property, but no systematic solution of this problem.
Other questions? Go ahead. Yes. Just I'm asked to repeat the question for the audience. The question is about the book Neighbors and how it was received in Poland.
Well, I don't want to dominate the panel. The book by Jan Tomasz Gross, a Polish exilee historian now in the United States, steered the most intense, greatest, biggest controversy about history in Poland ever. It was some 15 years ago when it started. It took about 2 years, and I was an eyewitness and participant to this controversy. As the small book depicts a horrible crime committed in a small town in a Soviet zone of occupation in summer of 1941 when the German army invades, well, pre-war Eastern Poland, 1939 to 1941, Soviet Belarus. Polish inhabitants of the little town of Jedwabne killed their Jewish neighbors. This is the short story of it. And it stirred a lot of controversy. And I would say that this controversy, while extremely painful, and to give you an example, I participated in a debate in the Polish Academy of Science, the Institute of History. Around the table you have some 50 professors and doctors of history, and after about an hour, a quarter of them was crying. Okay, I have never seen anything like this. That was extremely emotional, and that was also very fruitful in terms, I mean as Poles in Poland, we have developed a language to speak about the most difficult topics. And then A new monument was erected in the town of Jedwabne. Actually, a few months after the publication of the book, 80% of the population knew the name of the town, which is a small town they have never heard before. So one of the positive aspects of these long debates was widespread acknowledgement that Poles were not only the poor victims of the Nazi oppression in Poland, which was not the case before. And that was the first, well, maybe not the first, but the best known of a series of the book on similar topics. What was the Polish attitudes, Polish attitudes, I stress the plural, towards the fate of the Jews under German occupation.
Let me ask, since there have been two questions for Professor Stola, does anyone have a question for Professor Leff or for Dr. Madoff here in terms of anything they've said today or their earlier presentations or their published work? Yes.
I'd like to ask Professor Rupert about films about the Holocaust, and specifically that post-war period you were talking about. There was a film called The Stranger by Orson Welles, which I think it may have been the first American film about the Holocaust. Now, my question is, I never heard of this until I came to Israel. I saw it on TV here on educational TV here in Israel. I learned I never heard of it, and of course, Wells is a very famous movie. Now, do you know, could it be possible that somehow that film was suppressed there in the Japanese?
No. I mean, it may not have been shown a lot, but I mean, with the First Amendment, you can't actually suppress a film. I'm not familiar with it. I suspect that, there wasn't a lot of films made until, The Pawnbroker was sort of a breakthrough moment. The film about Judgment at Nuremberg was, but you don't start seeing a lot of that until the 1980s. And I think it's more just it's American system, it's capitalism, it's what the producers and directors and distributors of films think the audience would be interested in. So I would suspect it would be nothing more than that, huh? I wouldn't use the word censorship, because censorship does have a more specific meaning, which is that the government in some ways keeps the movie from being made or being circulated. But certainly, the market has a profound pull too. And also, this is another issue entirely, but there's been some recent work on this as well, which is, as we know, that many of the major movie studio heads were Jewish themselves. They had, during the 30s, there was a question of the second biggest market for American films was in Germany. So they also exerted, and here it was a little bit more somewhat formal censorship, because they did have a board that looked at movies in particular. There was a tendency, you wanted to be able to market your films in Germany, and if you wanted to be able to market your films in Germany, both the German government and the American government had certain kinds of restrictions. So in the earlier period, there was, some of it was formal censorship, some of it was the same phenomenon that I found in looking at the New York Times, which is, the New York Times was run by an American Jew, just like the studio heads, many of whom were American Jews, and there was reluctance to be too much identified as Jewish and to take up Jewish themes. There were some exceptions to that, certainly both in the American press and in American movies. But when you're talking about the American context, it tends to be much more the people who make these decisions, their assessments of what the market is. I say assessments because they didn't really know, but they were making judgments about what they thought would work and what they thought wouldn't.
Ask if there's a, yes, Robert.
First, I have one quick comment regarding the Polish government in exile. Many years ago, when I was a student in the United Kingdom, I got to know the man who was the foreign minister
Thank you for this question. Actually, Count Raczyński was indeed a key person in influencing the British and other allied governments to issue this declaration. And by the way, this declaration was very important because it spoke about the crimes committed against civilians in Europe, including Jewish population in many countries. That meant also Germany. And I think that was the precedent for the future, speaking about the sovereignty of the state. That was an important achievement. But the government, and including Raczyński, was very disappointed because for the London Poles, it was the first step to achieve the true objective, which was to have reprisals against Germany, to stop German crimes in occupied Europe, in this case in occupied Poland, against Jews and non-Jews. So it was a success because of this unprecedented declaration. But then, in the weeks after, you can see how they continue to hammer the topic, providing fresh information of atrocities, and nothing happens. And we have seen in a presentation a document coming from Eden to Churchill why reprisals and dropping of leaflets that the bombing of German cities is because of crimes committed against civilians is, so to speak, impractical. They had several reasons. And I would stress, what is interesting for me that this topic is so marginal to all the debates about the reactions to the Holocaust. That was the demand of the Jewish underground. We devote a lot of time and attention to non-bombing of Auschwitz or non-bombing of the railroads, while the demand for reprisals was much more important when still a part of the Polish Jewry was alive. Maybe that's because it's so morally sensitive. You know, if I had to return back to London in 1942, would I vote for killing German women and children to stop the German crimes in occupied Poland? This I'm not sure. Raczyński didn't have to be apologetic because he did some very important steps, actually more than information ministry, his colleague in information ministry. But what he wrote in his memoirs after the war and in several statements related to the topic was that it was very clear that Poland was not a powerful member of the anti-German alliance at that time, not only in stopping, making the allies somehow protect the Jews of Poland, but making the allies protect anyone in Poland.
Regarding the response of American Jewish leaders to the crisis of the St. Louis, there was almost no public response by leaders of the mainstream Jewish organizations such as the American Jewish Congress, American Jewish Committee, B'nai B'rith, for two reasons. I mentioned earlier that officials of the Joint Distribution Committee negotiated to find havens, temporary havens, for the St. Louis passengers in Europe. So part of the reason that the American Jewish leadership held back was a sense that they were hoping, counting on the Joint to be able to negotiate for the passengers to be admitted to Cuba or subsequently to Europe. But that's only part of the reason, because at the same time there were no public statements, no rallies, no kind of public expression by the Jewish leaders. And so I think the other part of the reason for their silence was their general reluctance to publicly take issue with President Roosevelt. And this derived, in some cases, from their strong personal loyalty to FDR, the Democratic Party, the New Deal, for example, in the case of Rabbi Stephen Wise, head of the American Jewish Congress, and a general kind of a timidity, a sense that if Jews were too outspoken on Jewish issues, or in this case to help Jewish refugees, that it might provoke an anti-Semitic backlash in the United States. Now, one might legitimately ask, as I'm often asked when I speak, has American Jewish leadership or the American Jewish community learned the lessons from those years? Have they responded any more effectively in subsequent crises? And to some extent, the answer is yes, they have. And the most compelling example certainly would be the Soviet Jewry protest movement of the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, when American Jews and also American Jewish leaders, but especially the grassroots, did exactly what the previous generation did not do. They marched, they lobbied, they wrote letters,
They made Soviet Jewry a part of culture, of American Jewish culture, because they set an empty plate at their Seder tables, and they wore bracelets with the names of refuseniks, and they made Soviet Jewry a part of the American Jewish agenda. Incidentally, I've had the opportunity over the years to interview some of the leading activists in the Soviet Jewry movement, people like, let's say, Glenn Richter, director of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and others, and many of them have said to me that it was their awareness of the failure of their parents' generation to protest during the Holocaust that to a significant extent motivated them to speak out, to not want to repeat those errors. And I'll mention on a related note, I was invited to address an AIPAC student leadership gathering. So these are 8 college kids from around the U.S. who are active in AIPAC, active in support of Israel around the country. And I was asked to address them specifically about the 400 rabbis who marched to Washington in 1943. And the AIPAC staff member who asked me to do this said that it was that march which inspired him to become a pro-Israel activist, and he wanted these young people to hear about some of the very few Jews who during the Holocaust had spoken out, had marched. He wanted them to look at those rabbis as role models for contemporary pro-Israel activism. All of which kind of leads me to a broader thought or comment I'd like to share with you as we wind up this session. When we research and we write and we talk about the events of the Holocaust years, what's our ultimate purpose? What do we really? Why are we doing this? Obviously, on one level, as historians, we're interested in preserving the integrity of the historical record, learning history, talking about history for its own sake. But in a more practical sense, I think ultimately all of us really want to know more about the Holocaust and the world's reaction because we all share a commitment to try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Ultimately, I think that's the most important purpose of all of these studies. And so the case of Rwanda is something which is important to comment on briefly for a specific reason. The Rwanda genocide in 1994 involved the slaughter by machetes of about 800,000 people over the course of 100 days, with full international news media coverage. So the world was aware of it. The Clinton administration was aware of it. Samantha Power, who is currently the United States ambassador to the United Nations, wrote some years ago a fascinating book about how America responded to mass murder and ethnic cleansing and genocide in different countries over the years. And in her chapter about Rwanda, now this is long before she became the U.S. ambassador to the UN. She was a journalist in these days. And the book ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize. In the section about Rwanda, she describes how Susan Rice, Dr. Susan Rice, who was then a senior State Department official at the Africa desk, how Rice was involved in top-level policy discussions within the Clinton administration as to whether or not they should respond to the ongoing slaughter in Rwanda. And this was in the early days of the genocide there. So there was still time to respond if the top policymakers in the administration felt there should be a response and could persuade the president. The debate was whether or not the U.S. should become more involved, or at a minimum, whether the U.S. should support the continued presence in Rwanda of a small United Nations peacekeeping force, which was able to do some good work and would have been able to do more had they been left in place. But a number of the countries that were participating wanted to pull the troops out at the first sign of trouble because they were afraid the troops would be killed. Anyway, in the policy discussion about whether or not to respond, Susan Rice argued, now again, it's 1994, so that meant there were congressional elections coming up in the fall. She argued that the administration should not intervene in any way, and in fact should not support even keeping the UN troops there. She said, because if the U.S. said that, actually, let me be a little more specific. The initial debate was whether or not to call it genocide. It was not even at the point of saying should we do anything. It was just should we acknowledge publicly that it's genocide. And Susan Rice opposed acknowledging that it was genocide, and she argued, and this is what Samantha Power revealed, she argued that if we call it genocide and then we don't do anything, and she was against doing anything, then we could lose, the Democratic Party could suffer in the elections in the fall because they would look like hypocrites. So on that basis, for these very cold, calculating really political reasons, Rice opposed even calling it genocide. Now, when this came out in Samantha Power's book, Rice did not deny it. And then it came up again briefly about a year ago. So a year ago now, by this time, Samantha Power was now the ambassador to the UN. And Susan Rice, who had been the ambassador to the UN, was now being nominated to become National Security Advisor to President Obama, putting her in one of the most important foreign policy positions in the United States government. And it came out briefly in the press, sort of as if, isn't this a curious thing? Samantha Power, who revealed this, is now the ambassador, and isn't this kind of embarrassing for Susan Rice? And yet this really disturbing revelation had no effect whatsoever on Susan Rice becoming National Security Advisor. There was virtually no opposition, and she is today in that important position. And my feeling, my comment here is that what we really need to aim for is a time when the international community, and the United States in particular, has become so, has accepted the importance of intervening against genocide, that somebody who was opposed to it and tried to block even recognize it as genocide should not be able to be promoted to a senior foreign policy position as if there was nothing wrong with what she did, because there was something very wrong with what she did.
Look, we're going to have to wind this up. Laurel will speak in less than 1 minute in response to what Rafi said.
Yeah, that was not really a fair characterization. The first reason is that the reason you didn't want to call it a genocide was because if you called it a genocide, then you had to take action. So it wasn't simple, you still might say you wanted to intervene, but the reason that the language wasn't used was because it in itself gave you a legal obligation. The second thing that I think is important to say, just in terms of fairness, is that Susan Rice said that this was a horrible thing to say. She apologized for it many times over. It's not as if it was then, I thought this was a good thing, I think this makes sense, and therefore I'm taking this policy position. Then the third thing, and I think I'm still under my minute, is the New Yorker actually did a very interesting profile of Samantha Power recently, in which it explained the sort of difficulties that she's experiencing now as UN ambassador when she does have this very idealistic book, and now she's confronted with the reality of it, and it's very interesting. So I would just say that's a little bit different than was presented.
All right, we're going to close, but 1 minute or less, and then this session is ended.
A few months ago, thanks to the leaks of all these telegrams and internal government documents that have been coming out in the last year. Some documents came out about the role of Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, in this episode that I'm describing. Susan Rice and Madeleine Albright were very closely aligned in the position they took about not wanting to intervene in the Rwanda genocide. What came out was this. At the time, Madeleine Albright insisted she had nothing to do with the withdrawal of the UN troops. But when these documents came out a few months ago, we have in her own writing, Madeleine Albright at that time was the U.S. ambassador to the UN. We now have telegrams from her to the White House in her own position, saying that lobbying against allowing the UN troops to stay in Rwanda. So she actively intervened to pull the UN troops out, all the while, of course, denying at the time that was her position. And Albright and Rice, that was their position, non-intervention. And I think that's something that they should be held accountable for.
Okay, the session is ended now. People can talk in the hallway and debate this back and forth there.